Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly back into the raw, resilient world of medieval peasants, those ordinary, unnamed people who turned the brutal grip of winter into just another season they could outlast. These weren't knights in shining armor or lords feasting in stone halls. They were the everyday backbone of villages, the ones who plowed fields, tended animals, mended roofs, and somehow kept breathing through nights so cold they could freeze your thoughts mid-prayer. Their story isn't one of glory. It's one of quiet, stubborn ingenuity, shared body heat, patched up hope, and the kind of determination that says, not tonight, to death itself. So before we drift into their world, if these gentle history tales help you relax, slow your breathing, and ease towards sleep, consider dropping a like or subscribing, only if you truly enjoy them. And in the comments, share where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. I love picturing the little glowing dots on the map. Someone wrapped in blankets in Tokyo as the sun rises, another in Sao Paulo with midnight rain tapping the window, all of us connected for a little while by the same calm voice in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a soft fan for that low, steady hum that feels like distant waves. Pull the covers up a bit higher, settle deep into your pillow, and let's begin this gentle journey together. When people imagine the Middle Ages, the pictures that usually come to mind are bright and heroic. Knights clashing in tournaments, banners snapping in the wind, long tables piled high with roasted meats, spiced wine, and laughter echoing off stone walls. Those scenes existed, but they belonged to a tiny fraction of society. For the overwhelming majority, the peasants who worked the land from dawn until the light failed, who grew the grain, raised the livestock, spun the wool, and kept the entire medieval machine fed. Winter was not a season of merriment. It was an annual examination with no mercy, no extra credit, and no second chances. The only passing grade was waking up alive the next morning. Picture yourself there. You live in a small, single-room hut built of wattle and daub, a latticework of thin branches and twigs woven together like a giant basket, then plastered over with a rough mixture of mud, straw, clay, and often animal dung. The dung wasn't chosen to be disgusting. It was cheap, sticky, abundant, and surprisingly effective at filling gaps and adding a bit of insulation. Still, these walls were never thick. On a calm day, you could hear a neighbor coughing 2 huts away. On a windy night, the drafts found every tiny crack and rushed inside like uninvited guests who refused to leave. There were no glass windows. Glass was so costly that even many manor houses had only a few small, precious panes. Instead, you had narrow openings covered with stretched animal hides, oilcloth, or wooden shutters that never quite sealed properly. In deep winter, those shutters might be closed tight, but the cold still seeped through, turning every breath into a small white cloud inside your own home. The roof was thatch, layers of dried reeds or straw piled thick and roped down. It looked quaint from a distance, but after months of rain, snow, and wind it sagged, leaked, and sometimes let in more than just water. A squirrel or mouse dropping through a gap onto your sleeping mat was not uncommon. Nothing says cozy medieval evening like wildlife joining you for dinner. Inside, the temperature hovered only a few degrees above whatever misery was happening outside. If the field stood at -12 degrees Celsius under a clear, star-filled sky, your hut might reach -7 degrees Celsius or -8 degrees Celsius near the fire, and far colder in the corners. That wasn't warmth. That was the cold being polite enough to slow down before it finished you off. Nights arrived early and stayed long. Once the sun disappeared, the world shrank to the faint, flickering circle of light thrown by the central hearth. Beyond that circle, everything was black, silent, and bitterly cold. The wind searched for every weakness, a gap in the daub, a lifted thatch edge, a poorly fitted shutter, and poured through, swirling around ankles, creeping under blankets, stinging cheeks and ears until they burned. The fire itself was rarely generous. Most peasant homes had no proper chimney. Smoke rose from an open pit in the floor, sometimes ringed with a few stones for safety, and drifted upward, exiting through a small roof opening called a smoke hole, through wall cracks, or simply hanging thick in the air until your eyes watered and your throat scratched. The fire warmed whoever sat closest, usually the person tending it, while everyone else fought for scraps of heat. If you were on the far side of the room, you may as well have been outside, only with more smoke in your lungs and fewer ways to escape. Clothing offered limited defense. Most peasants owned 2 or 3 tunics of coarse wool, scratchy, heavy when wet, and never quite clean. Over that went leggings or hose, a hooded cloak that had seen many winters, and perhaps a patched sheepskin or old blanket thrown on top. Layering helped trap air, but wool soaks up dampness like a sponge, and winter dampness was everywhere, from breath, from cooking steam, from leaks in the roof. Wet wool is heavier, colder, and clings miserably to skin. Feet were wrapped in rags or strips of cloth, then forced into wooden clogs or worn leather shoes that leaked. Hats and mittens were rare treasures. Simple wool caps pulled low, gloves sewn from scraps of leather or cloth. Children were bundled until they looked like walking bundles of laundry, arms pinned to their sides, waddling stiffly. It wasn't fashion. It was armor, imperfect, smelly, itchy armor, against a season that wanted to strip you bare. Beds were even less forgiving. Most families slept on sacks or large linen sheets stuffed with straw, hay, or dried rushes, laid directly on the dirt floor or on a low wooden frame if the household could manage one. No soft feather mattresses, no thick quilts filled with down. Those belonged to the wealthy. Just crunchy, shifting plant matter that flattened overnight, poked through the fabric, and smelled faintly of barnyard and mildew. Fleas, lice, and other small creatures considered it excellent housing. Every movement produced a crackling rustle. Every turn brought a new jab from a stray stalk. A good night's sleep wasn't measured by comfort or dreams. It was measured by whether you still had feeling in your extremities when dawn arrived. The cold didn't attack from one direction. It came from above through the leaky thatch, sideways through cracked and crumbling daub, and worst of all, upward from the frozen earth itself. Floors were simply packed dirt, sometimes scattered with a thin layer of rushes or straw, but never enough to block the deep, patient chill rising like a slow tide. Drop a wooden spoon at night, and by morning it would be rimed with frost. Peasants fought back with whatever they could gather, extra straw mats if they could harvest or scavenge enough, old rushes layered, and replaced only when they began to rot and smell worse than usual, moss and rags jammed tightly into wall gaps and cracks around doors. Some families smeared fresh mud mixed with dung over the exterior walls each autumn, letting it dry into a rough additional skin against the wind. It wasn't attractive. It wasn't permanent, but it bought precious degrees, a few more hours of warmth, a slightly better chance of waking up alive. At the absolute center of survival stood the hearth, the one true ally in the long war against winter. No grand stone fireplace with a carved mantel, no chimney sweeping smoke neatly away, just an open pit dug into the floor, sometimes edged with a ring of stones to contain the flames. Smoke rose lazily, drifted toward the roof hole, leaked through cracks, or simply hung thick in the rafters until the air tasted of soot and your clothes carried the smell for weeks. The fire was everything at once: warmth, light, cooking surface, gathering point, psychological lifeline. Letting it die overnight was unthinkable. A dead hearth meant the cold had won the night, and winning the night often meant losing the next day, or worse. Reigniting a fire from cold ashes in the dark was no small task. Matches didn't exist. Lighters were centuries away. You had flint and steel, a small piece of charcloth or dried fungus that caught sparks, And whatever dry kindling you had managed to store, thin twigs, shredded bark, perhaps a precious handful of dry grass tucked away from summer. In freezing darkness, with numb fingers and breath clouding the air, coaxing one tiny spark into flame could take 20 minutes of patient blowing, shielding, and prayer. One careless gust from a crack in the wall could snuff it out and force you to start again. Every family knew the dread of a completely dead fire on a minus 15 degrees Celsius night. To prevent that disaster, peasants banked the fire before sleep. Banking meant raking the glowing embers into a tight pile, then carefully covering them with a thick layer of ash from earlier burnings. The ash acted as insulation, slowing combustion so the coals smoldered gently through the hours instead of blazing up and burning out. Done correctly, you could rise at dawn, brush away the ash, add a few dry sticks, and nurse the embers back to life with just a few breaths. Done incorrectly, too little ash, too much air, or a sudden draft, and the coals went cold, leaving you facing the same grim restart in the freezing dark. Fire banking was a quiet domestic art, passed down like a family recipe. Every household had its small variations. Some preferred dry ash only. Others left a tiny air hole for the coals to breathe. Some packed the pile tightly. Others left it looser. Neighbors sometimes argued good-naturedly over whose method kept embers alive longest. It was the medieval equivalent of debating the perfect way to brew tea, except the stakes were literal life and death. On nights when wind battered the hut particularly hard, some families took turns waking to check the fire. A child old enough to hold a poker, a grandparent who slept lightly anyway. It wasn't restful. It was survival sleep, shallow, interrupted, communal. But it kept the ember alive. And one surviving ember meant one more day. On the very coldest nights, when even the best banked fire struggled and drafts still slipped through patched walls, survival demanded more than one hearth and one family. It demanded each other, and sometimes more. Now let's continue easing deeper into those long, frozen medieval nights. We've already seen the thin walls, the leaky thatch, the drafts that slipped in like thieves, the fire that fought so hard but never quite won. But even with all that ingenuity, the moss-stuffed cracks, the dung-smeared exteriors, the carefully banked embers, the cold still pressed in from every side. And so medieval peasants turned to the one resource they always had in abundance: each other. The more the merrier wasn't just a cheerful saying in winter. It was literal survival math. When the temperature dropped low enough that breath froze on your eyelashes and the dirt floor radiated cold like a block of ice, personal space became a luxury no one could afford. Privacy, almost non-existent. Modesty, temporarily forgotten. The goal on the coldest nights wasn't comfort or dignity. It was collective body heat. Don't wake up frozen to the floor. That was the only rule that mattered. Entire families piled together in the warmest corner of the hut, usually the one nearest the hearth, with a fire's fading glow still through a fragile circle of warmth. They arranged themselves like a living quilt. Parents in the middle if they were sturdy, children tucked between them or against their sides, grandparents layered on the outer edges or pulled closer if they were frail. Infants and toddlers were placed deepest in the pile, small, hot little furnaces that radiated heat like tiny stoves. Older children learned quickly to curl tight and stay still. Shifting too much could push someone toward the drafty wall and earn a sharp elbow or hiss scolding in the dark. Bedding was communal too. Most households had one or two large straw or rush-stuffed mattresses, big sacks of coarse linen or patch cloth that covered enough ground for the whole family to lie side by side, or at least in overlapping rows. If there was only one mattress, everyone shared it. If there weren't enough, some slept directly on layered straw spread across the floor. The straw itself provided a small insulating barrier against the frozen earth, but its real value came when bodies pressed together, shared warmth trapped between layers of wool, linen, and skin. A good night meant waking up with everyone still pink and breathing. A bad one meant someone on the edge, shivering violently by dawn, toes numb, fingers white. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. Straw poked through fabric, bodies shifted and snored. Someone always needed to get up to pee in the night, and the cold rush of air when the door opened felt like a slap. The smells were intense. Unwashed wool, smoke, sweat, livestock lingering on clothes, the earthy mustiness of straw that had been slept on for weeks. But discomfort was the price of not dying. And when the wind screamed outside and frost patterned the inside of the shutters, that price suddenly seemed very reasonable. Sometimes the pile grew larger than just family. Neighbors might arrive at dusk with a sick child, an elderly relative, or simply because their own fire had died and the night was too dangerous to spend alone. The hut door would open, letting in a blast of icy air that made everyone groan, and then more bodies would squeeze in. "There's always room," someone would mutter, shifting over on the mattress, making space for one more back against the wall or one more child curled at the feet. In the smallest hamlets, entire extended families or close-knit neighbors sometimes spent the worst nights together in one or two huts, rotating who hosted so no single home became too overcrowded every night. It was chaotic, noisy, smelly, and warm, exactly what was needed. Livestock played a starring role too. On the very coldest nights, animals weren't just allowed inside. They were actively welcomed. Cows, goats, sheep, pigs, even chickens were brought in from their lean-to shelters or pens. The reasoning was brutally practical. Animals generated body heat. A full-grown cow or ox could raise the temperature of a small hut by several degrees simply by existing. Goats and sheep were smaller but numerous, and their thick wool trapped heat like living blankets. Pigs, with their high body temperature and dense fat layer, were especially prized on freezing nights. They radiated warmth like small, snoring furnaces. The hut transformed into a living, breathing space heater. Cows often lay against the longest wall, their massive sides pressed to the daub, so heat seeped through to the people on the other side. Goats and sheep curled in corners or near the hearth. Pigs sprawled wherever they pleased, sometimes right in the middle of the sleeping pile, grunting contentedly as children used their warm flanks for pillows. Chickens roost on beams or in baskets hung from the rafters, occasionally fluttering down to peck at crumbs near the fire. The noise was constant, low mooing, soft bleating, rustling straw, the occasional sharp cluck or snort. The smells layered thickly: animal musk, manure, wet wool, smoke, human sweat, all mingling in the close air. But again, discomfort was secondary. Warmth was primary. There were risks, of course. Animals weren't house-trained. Morning cleanup was a grim but necessary ritual. A cow might shift in the night and knock over a sleeping child. A goat could chew through a precious blanket or cloak. A panicked chicken might flutter into the fire and scatter embers. Yet the benefits far outweighed the hazards. A household that shared space with its livestock had a measurable advantage. Fewer cases of frostbite, fewer nights lost to hypothermia, fewer funerals in early spring. The animals themselves benefited too, safer from wolves, thieves, and the worst of the weather. It was a pact of mutual survival. In many regions, especially in northern Europe where winters were longest and coldest, this practice became so routine that it barely raised comment. Visitors from warmer climates or wealthier classes were often shocked. They live with their beasts. But peasants simply shrugged. Better the stink than the grave. And when spring finally arrived, the animals were led back outside. The hut aired out as much as possible, and life returned to its normal rhythm. The memory of those shared, sweltering, snoring nights lingered, though, a reminder that in the deepest cold, the line between human and animal blurred, and survival belonged to whoever could generate, trap, and share the most heat. Clothing followed the same logic if you owned it. You wore it all at once, every layer, every night. Fashion didn't exist in winter. Warmth did. Most peasants had a basic wardrobe built for layering rather than style. Closest to the skin went a linen shift or shirt, coarse, often patched, rarely washed in winter because wet linen takes forever to dry and freezes stiff if hung outside. Over that came 1 or 2 woolen tunics, heavy, scratchy, knee-length or longer. Wool was the miracle fabric of the age. It insulates even when damp, wicks moisture away from the skin, and traps air for warmth. But it was heavy, it itched, and once soaked it stayed soaked for days. Leggings or hose, wool or linen, covered the legs, tied at the waist, and sometimes at the knees. A hooded cloak or mantle went on top, often hooded to protect the head and neck. If the family owned a sheepskin or old fur scrap, it was draped over the shoulders like a cape. Shoes were wooden clogs or leather-turned shoes, often lined with rags or straw for extra insulation. Feet were wrapped in strips of cloth or old wool scraps before being forced into footwear, a process that could take several minutes of pushing and cursing on a cold morning. Children were swaddled until they looked like walking bundles. Infants were wrapped tightly in linen bands, then tucked into layers of wool and sheepskin until only their faces peeked out. Toddlers wore miniature versions of adult clothing, tunics, leggings, tiny cloaks, all oversized so they could grow into them. The goal was to create as many air-trapping layers as possible. A child dressed for winter might wear 3 tunics, 2 pairs of hose, a cloak, a cap, and wrapped feet, looking more like a small sack of laundry than a human being. Mobility suffered, but warmth won. Hats and head coverings were essential. Heat escapes fastest from the head, and bare ears could freeze solid in minutes. Most people wore simple wool caps pulled low over the ears, sometimes tied under the chin. Mittens or gloves, when they existed, were homemade from leather scraps, wool scraps, or rabbit fur. They were often fingerless for dexterity, or simple mitts sewn from whatever was available. Women sometimes wrapped their heads in linen coifs or woolen veils, adding another insulating layer. Washing clothes in winter was almost impossible. Dragging garments to a frozen stream, breaking ice, pounding them in icy water, then waiting days for them to dry, or watching them freeze solid on the line, was impractical and dangerous. Most peasants simply didn't wash outer layers from November to March. The accumulated grime, body oils, sweat, and smoke actually helped. It clogged fabric pores, reduced breathability, and created a crude windproof barrier. Clean linen wicked heat away. Dirty, greasy wool held it in. A tunic that hadn't been washed since Michaelmas might smell like a barnyard, but it kept you warmer than a freshly laundered one ever could. Layering without changing was standard. You added outer garments on top of yesterday's layers and the day before's until you were wearing half your wardrobe at once. Stains, grease, mud, all became part of the armor. By February, a tunic might carry the story of the entire winter in its crust. A dark ring from leaning against a cow, a grease spot from roasting a rare scrap of fat, a patch of mud from a fall in the snow. It wasn't attractive. It wasn't hygienic by modern standards, but it worked. And in a season where survival trumped everything else, that was enough. When the cold grew so deep that even layered wool and shared body heat weren't enough, peasants turned to one last, simple weapon: food. A full stomach was internal heating. Digestion generates heat. The body burns calories to break down food, and that slow-burning process radiates warmth from within for hours. The heavier and fattier the meal before bed, the longer the furnace burned. Medieval peasants understood this instinctively. Dinner on winter nights wasn't light or delicate. It was dense, starchy, fatty, designed to sit in the gut like a slow coal fire. A typical winter supper might be a thick pottage, barley or oats boiled with root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, onions, whatever dried peas or beans remained, and any scraps of salted pork, bacon rind, or lard that could be spared. Bread, dense rye or barley loaves, soaked up broth and added bulk. If the family had slaughtered a pig in autumn and salted the meat, a small piece might be added for flavor and fat. Fat was prized above all. It burned slowly, released more energy, and coated the stomach like a protective lining. A spoonful of rendered lard stirred into porridge could keep a body warmer longer than an extra blanket. Portions were generous on the coldest nights. Parents urged children to eat more. Fill your belly, little one, or the frost will steal your toes. Nobody saved room for dessert. There rarely was any. The goal was to load the digestive system with fuel that would smolder through the small hours. Heavy meals brought their own problems: bloated stomachs, vivid dreams, the occasional midnight need to stumble outside into the snow. But the trade-off was worth it. A full gut meant internal heat when external heat failed. Some families saved their best food for the very worst nights. A bit of smoked sausage, a wedge of hard cheese, a handful of dried apples, small luxuries that provided concentrated energy. Others relied on bulk. Huge bowls of oatmeal or barley gruel thickened with whatever fat or milk was available. The act of eating together became ritualistic, huddled close to the hearth, passing the wooden spoon, sharing stories between bites. It wasn't just nutrition. It was morale. A warm, full belly made the cold seem a little less personal. And when the meal ended, the fire was banked, the animals settled, the family arranged in their human quilt, the last defense activated. Breathing shifted to shallow, nose-only inhales to warm the air before it reached the lungs. Bodies curled tight, prayers were whispered, and then came the long wait for dawn. We've already walked through the thin walls, the drafts that hunted every crack, the fire that was both savior and tease, the layered bodies pressed together like a living blanket, the livestock brought inside to share their heat, the heavy meals that burned slow in the belly, the shallow nose breathing to warm each inhale, the hot stones wrapped in rags and tucked into straw mattresses. All of it was clever, stubborn, necessary, but none of it was perfect. Winter still took its toll, and when it did, medieval peasants met that loss the only way they knew how, together, quietly, and with a faith that refused to let the cold have the final word. The hearth was the beating heart of the hut, but even hearts can falter. Keeping it alive through the night was a constant, quiet war. The banking of embers under ash worked most evenings, but not always. A sudden gust through a roof gap, a careless animal knocking the ash aside, a child too sleepy to check properly. Any of these could snuff the coals. When that happened, the family faced the grim task of starting over in darkness with numb fingers. Flint struck steel, sparks fell on a char cloth or dried fungus. Breath coaxed the tiniest glow. Minutes stretched into half hours of patient nursing. One careless puff and the spark died. One too many and it flared and consumed the kindling too fast. In the deepest cold, that process could feel endless. Some nights families simply couldn't restart it. The fire went out for good, and the cold rushed in like water through a broken dam. When that happened, the hut became a tomb of slow freezing. Body heat was all they had left. The family huddled tighter, wrapping cloaks and blankets around the youngest and oldest first. They breathed shallow, nose only, conserving every calorie. They sang softly, told stories in whispers, anything to keep minds off the creeping numbness in fingers and toes. Sometimes neighbors heard the silence, no smoke rising from the roof hole, and came with a glowing coal carried in a clay pot or wrapped in damp rags. A single ember share between huts could save lives. But on the worst nights, even neighbors were too far, too frozen, too afraid to leave their own fires. Morning would find a family still locked together, some no longer breathing, faces peaceful in the frost that had settled over them like a white veil. Death in winter was never surprising. It was expected, almost routine. A cough in November could become pneumonia by Christmas. A child who fell asleep too far from the fire might not wake. An elder whose joints ached too much to move might simply slip away in the night. Frostbite blackened fingers, toes, ear tips, noses. Survivors carried the loss as a quiet badge. Winter took this piece, but not all of me. Entire households sometimes vanished. Spring thaw revealed them still huddled, arms around one another, as if trying to share one last breath of warmth. Neighbors would bury them together, say prayers, and move on. Grief was real, but it had to share space with the next day's work. There was no time to stop. Yet amid the loss, peasants built small rituals of hope. Before sleep, many knelt together on the dirt floor, hands clasped, voices low, offering simple prayers. They asked for the fire to hold, for the roof to stay whole, for the children to wake warm. Specific saints were called upon. Saint Sebastian for protection against cold sicknesses, Saint Blaise for throats raw from icy air, Saint Nicholas for households in danger of ruin. Some sprinkled holy water near the hearth, marked doorframes with blessed chalk after Epiphany, kept a small vigil candle burning if they could spare the wax. These weren't grand ceremonies, just quiet words spoken into smoke-filled rafters, tangled in breath clouds, tucked under blankets like hidden treasures. Promises were common too. Lord, if you bring us through this night, I'll be kinder to widow Agnes, even though she took my best hen. If the baby's cough eases by morning, I'll give half our grain to the church. Faith wasn't abstract. It was urgent, practical bargaining. It gave shape to hope when hope felt thin. And somehow, most nights, it worked. Dawn arrived. Embers still glowed. Toe still moved. Another victory, small and unnamed. Community stretched beyond the family hut. Villages watched one another. If smoke stopped rising from a neighbor's roof, someone noticed. If a child didn't appear at the well, someone asked. In the worst winters, villages acted as one organism. Food stores were quietly shared. A sack of barley here, a piece of salted pork there. Wood was split and carried to houses where the pile ran low. Elders who couldn't fetch water found buckets left at their door. Children ran messages, carried coals, helped herd animals into safer shelters. Old quarrels, over boundaries, stolen tools, stray livestock, were often set aside. Winter made enemies remember they were neighbors first. This wasn't sentimentality. It was calculation. A family saved today might save yours tomorrow. A hut that collapsed under snow could be rebuilt faster with every hand helping. A child kept alive through January might grow to help plow in spring. Survival was communal arithmetic. One more person breathing meant one more pair of hands for spring planting, one more voice for harvest songs, one more heartbeat to push back the dark next winter. When spring finally broke, usually late, grudgingly, with mud instead of flowers, the relief was quiet but profound. Roofs stopped leaking. Animals returned to outside pens. Layers of clothing were peeled away. Straw bedding was burned or spread on fields as mulch. Huts were aired, walls patched with fresh daub, floors swept of winter's accumulated grime. People greeted one another with small nods, tired smiles, the knowledge that they had done it again. Another winter survived, another year granted, but the memory stayed. The cold never fully left. It lived in blackened fingertips, in stories told by firelight, in the way a mother checked her child's breathing twice before sleeping, even in summer. Medieval peasants didn't conquer winter. They endured it, one night at a time, one ember at a time, one shared breath at a time. And in that endurance, they left something more lasting than stone castles or gilded crowns. A stubborn, unglamorous blueprint for how human beings can face the worst the world offers and still wake up tomorrow. Their legacy isn't written in chronicles or carved in cathedrals. It's stitched into the ordinary acts that kept life going: the banking of coals, the layering of bodies, the passing of a warm stone, the whispered prayer in the dark. Every time we turn up the heat on a winter night, pull an extra blanket over a child, share food with a neighbor in hard times, we echo them. We carry their quiet victories forward, invisible threads connecting us to people who never had our comforts, but still managed to keep the fire alive. So as you lie here now, warm, safe, listening to my voice fade into the background hum of your room, remember them. The nameless ones who turned shivering nights into mornings. The ones who taught us, without ever knowing we would listen, that resilience isn't loud. It's steady. It's shared. It's one more breath, one more ember, one more stubborn heartbeat at a time. Sleep well. The cold can't reach you tonight. We've come this far together through the thin walls that let the wind dance inside, the drafts that hunted every crack like playful ghosts, the hearth that was both lifeline and tease, the layered bodies pressed close in a human quilt, the livestock brought indoors to share their steady warmth, the heavy meals that burned slow in the belly like internal coals, the shallow nose breathing to warm each precious inhale, the hot stones wrapped in rags and tucked into straw mattresses, the banking of embers under ash, the shared watches through the small hours, the quiet prayers whispered into smoke-filled rafters, the neighborly coal carried in a clay pot when a fire died, the communal watchfulness that turned villages into one breathing organism. All of it was clever, stubborn, fragile, beautiful in its necessity. But even the most determined patchwork of tricks couldn't win every night. Sometimes winter took what came for, and when it did, medieval peasants met that loss the only way they knew how. Together, quietly, with a faith that refused to let the cold have the final word, and with a resilience that carried forward long after the frost had melted. The hearth was the beating heart of every hut, but hearts can falter. Banking the embers under ash worked on most nights, but not all. A sudden gust through a poorly patched roof hole, a goat shifting and scattering the ash pile, a child too exhausted awake for the midnight check. Any small failure could snuff the coals. When that happened, the family faced the grim ritual of starting over in pitch darkness with fingers already numb. Flint struck steel with a faint metallic ring. Sparks fell like dying stars on a charred cloth or dried tinder fungus. Breath, careful, shallow, warm, coaxed the tiniest red glow. Minutes stretched. One careless puff, and the spark vanished. One too forceful, and it flared brightly, then consumed the kindling too fast. In the deepest cold, when breath itself froze on lips, that process could feel endless. Some nights, they simply couldn't restart it. The fire went out completely, and the cold rushed in like water through a broken dam. Patient, relentless, victorious. When a hearth died for good, the hut became a slow freezing tomb. Body heat was all that remained. The family huddled tighter than ever, wrapping every cloak, blanket, and scrap around the youngest and oldest first. They breathed shallow, nose only, conserving every calorie of warmth. They sang softly, old lullabies, work songs, fragments of prayers, anything to keep minds off the creeping numbness in fingers, toes, ears. Sometimes neighbors heard the silence. No smoke curling from the roof hole at dawn, and came with a glowing coal carried in a clay pot or wrapped in damp rags. A single shared ember could save lives. But on the worst nights, even neighbors were too far, too frozen, too afraid to leave their own fires. Morning would find a family still locked together in their final embrace, some no longer breathing, faces peaceful under the frost that had settled over them like a white veil. Spring thaw revealed them weeks later, still huddled, arms around one another, as if trying to share one last breath until the very end. Death in winter was never surprising. It was expected, almost seasonal. A cough in November, could deepen in a pneumonia by Christmas. A child who fell asleep too far from the fire might not wake. An elder whose joints ached too much to move might simply slip away in the night. Frostbite blackened fingers, toes, ear tips, noses. Survivors carry the loss quietly. Blackened stumps wrapped in rags. A limp, a missing fingertip. Small, permanent reminders that winter took this piece, but not all of me. Entire households sometimes vanished. Spring revealed them still together, frozen in their desperate pile. Neighbors gently separating limbs for burial, saying prayers, and moving on. Grief was real, sharp, but it had to share space with the next day's work. There was no time to stop. Life demanded motion. Yet even in loss, peasants built small rituals of hope. Before sleep, many knelt together on the cold dirt floor, hands clasped, voices low and steady, offering simple prayers. They asked for the fire to hold through the night, for the roof to stay whole, for the children to wake warm, for the cows to keep breathing, so the hut stayed livable. Specific saints became winter companions. Saint Sebastian invoked against cold sicknesses that settled in lungs. Saint Blaise for throats raw from icy air. Saint Nicholas for households teetering on ruin. Some sprinkled holy water near the hearth, marked door frames with blessed chalk after Epiphany, kept a small vigil candle burning if they could spare the wax. A tiny, trembling light against the dark. These weren't grand ceremonies, just quiet words spoken into smoke-filled rafters, tangled in breath clouds, tucked under blankets like hidden treasures. Promises were common too. Lord, if you bring us through this night, I'll share the last of our barley with Widow Agnes, even though she took my best hen last summer. If the baby's cough eases by morning, I'll give half our grain to the church poor box. Faith wasn't abstract or distant. It was urgent, practical, bargaining, a conversation with someone who might listen when no one else could. It gave shape to hope when hope felt thin as winter sunlight. And somehow most nights, it worked. Dawn arrived. Embers still glowed under the ash. Fingers still moved. Toes still felt. Another small, unnamed victory. Community stretched beyond the single hut. Villages watched one another like a single living organism. If smoke stopped rising from a neighbor's roof at dawn, someone noticed. If a child didn't appear at the well to fetch water, someone asked. If an old woman's door stayed shut too long, someone knocked. In the worst winters, when blizzards buried paths and frost killed livestock, villages acted together. Food stores were quietly shared. A sack of barley here, a piece of salted pork there, a handful of dried peas carried across the snow. Wood was split and carried to houses where the pile ran low. Elders who couldn't fetch water found buckets left at their door by children who ran messages through the drifts. Neighbors with stronger hearths took in families whose roofs sagged under snow or whose fires had died. It wasn't sentimentality. It was calculation. A family saved today might save yours tomorrow. A hut rebuilt faster with every hand helping. A child kept alive through January might grow to help plow in spring. Survival was communal arithmetic. One more person breathing meant one more pair of hands for planting, one more voice for harvest songs, one more heartbeat to push back the dark next winter. This wasn't always harmonious. Feuds existed over boundaries, stolen tools, stray animals that damaged crops. Grudges simmered under the surface. But when nights grew deadly cold, old quarrels were often quietly shelved. A man who hadn't spoken to his neighbor since midsummer might still carry a shovelful of coals to his door if the hearth went dark. A woman who believed her sister-in-law had cheated her at market might still take in the sister-in-law's shivering children when their own hut filled with smoke from a failing fire. Winter made enemies remember they were neighbors first. Survival demanded it. When spring finally arrived, usually late, grudgingly, with mud instead of flowers, the relief was quiet but profound. Roofs stopped leaking ice water. Animals returned to outside pens, grateful for fresh air. Layers of clothing were peeled away one by one. Tunics aired, cloaks shaken free of soot. Straw bedding was burned or spread on fields as mulch. Huts were aired as much as possible, walls patched with fresh daub, floors swept of winter's accumulated grime. Straw fragments, animal hair, dried mud, the residue of shared nights. People greeted one another with small nods, tired smiles, the knowledge that they had done it again. Another winter survived, another year granted, but the memory never fully left. The cold lived on in blackened fingertips, in stories told by summer firelight, in the way a mother checked her child's breathing twice before sleeping even on warm nights. Medieval peasants didn't conquer winter. They endured it, one shallow breath at a time, one shared ember, one whispered promise, one stubborn heartbeat after another. And in that endurance, they left something far more lasting than stone castles or gilded crowns. A blueprint for how human beings can face the worst the world offers and still wake up tomorrow. Their legacy isn't written in chronicles or carved in cathedrals. It's stitched into the ordinary acts that kept life going. The banking of coals so embers survived the night. The layering of bodies so warmth was shared. The passing of a hot stone wrapped in rags. The quiet prayer spoken into smoke-filled rafters. The neighborly coal carried through snow when a fire died. Every time we turn up the heat on a winter night, pull an extra blanket over a sleeping child, share food with a neighbor when times are hard, check on someone who hasn't answered the door, we echo them. We carry their quiet victories forward, invisible threads connecting us to people who never had our comforts, but still managed to keep the fire alive. So as you lie here now, warm, safe, listening to my voice fade gently into the background hum of your room, remember them. The nameless ones who turned shivering nights into mornings. The ones who taught us, without ever knowing we would listen, that resilience isn't loud. It's steady. It's shared. It's one more breath, one more ember, one more stubborn heartbeat at a time. Sleep well tonight. The cold can't reach you here.